Alrighty, good evening and welcome in, everybody. It is officially 7 o'clock, so we're going to get this party started here with our first Civic Awareness series of 2023. Tonight's presentation will be presented by Jim Slusher. The topic, sorry, my brain turned off. It's a little late in the day. Tonight's topic is ideas for election reform. Tonight's presentation is going to last roughly an hour between Jim's presentation as well as the Q&A that we will do at the end of the presentation. You can ask questions for the question and answer portion at any time during tonight's presentation using the Q&A box that's on your Zoom toolbar. We will address all those questions at the end. Tonight's presentation is being recorded, just so you're aware at home, but don't worry, your cameras and microphones have been turned off through Zoom. So you will not be recorded, just Jim, myself, and some of my league friends from the League of Women Voters. You'll also notice that we have turned on closed captions. You can turn those on or off as you wish. And of course, if Zoom is acting up and technology just isn't going your way tonight and you have questions about that, you can throw those in the Q&A box as well. I'll be monitoring the Q&A for any of those questions, and hopefully I'll be able to answer you. Without further ado, I should also introduce myself. My name is Christopher Corrigan. I work with Cantigny Park, and I'm a partner with the League of Women Voters. I'm a programs coordinator for Cantigny, and very proud of this partnership that we have with the League. Without further ado, though, I do want to get us started, and I want to pass things over to Jean Pierce with the League, who's going to formally introduce tonight's presenter. So, Jean, I hand things over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Recently, the Daily Herald ran a series of editorials focusing on a variety of election issues that haven't gotten much attention in the news or public policy discussions in Illinois. The goal was to spark discussion and consider the ways we select candidates and make decisions through the ballot box. Our speaker tonight is Jim Slusher, Assistant Managing Editor for Opinion and Administration. He oversees the Daily Herald's editorial writing, selection of syndicated columns and cartoons, and letters to the editor for the opinion page. Working with an editorial board made up of top editors in the Herald newsroom, he helps shape the newspaper's voice on subjects of interest to suburban readers, while seeking to present an engaging mix of opinions on broad social and political topics, along with a forum for readers to present their views on whatever topics they consider important. Tonight, all of us look forward to a discussion about possible election reforms that have not been examined closely and could perhaps lead to restored faith in our elections. Please use the chat function or the Q&A to enter any questions or comments for Mr. Slusher, and please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you so much, Gina. I really appreciate this. I appreciate this opportunity to be with everyone. As you mentioned, this is a series of editorials that's a little different for us. You know, when we do editorial writing, or when you write any piece of opinion that's meant to persuade people or change their minds, you always hope they're going to change their minds immediately, and that what you say is going to turn on a light and make other people agree with you and go your way. And obviously, we hope for that, and we hope that this series produces some of the things that we'd like to see and that we'll talk about tonight. But we also knew that that was not really likely, that in fact, these topics are so broad and so in need of detailed thinking that to suggest that anything's going to happen in a month or a year, maybe even 2 or 3 years, would be hopeful at the best and not very realistic. So what we really wanted was to start things like this. Conversations where we can look at some things that aren't talked about a lot and that need to have more conversation. When we came up with this, I might talk about this a little bit more. We come up with this idea. There are a lot of issues related to the elections and election integrity today. It's really one of the most important issues facing the country, in my view. But there are a lot of tentacles to it, and many of them get a lot of discussion, things like campaign finance and so forth. But there are many others that people aren't talking about so much that are also important, and I think that are really integral to helping us have faith in our elections and better understand our elections. And so I'm hoping that through discussions like these, we can move in some of these directions. They may not go exactly the way that we describe in these editorials, but if we move anywhere in these directions, I think we'll be moving forward and helping advance the cause. So that's really where we wanted to go with this series. Before I get started talking about the series specifically, I'd sort of like to give you a brief description of who our editorial board is and how we work. So this will help you understand sort of how the series itself and the specific editorials were developed, and may give you a better idea of how editorials work in general. So I'll start by just describing who we are on the editorial board. As managing editor for Opinion, I oversee the board. I'm not the highest ranking person on the board. That would be Jim Bauman, our vice president and executive editor. But for issues related to opinion topics and how we produce editorials, I'm sort of the guiding light and the guiding force of that. Jim, of course, is on the board and has great voice, as everybody does who speaks and who gets involved in the discussions that we have. Lisa Miner is managing editor. Her operation is primarily dealing with the news. And as I'm sure you're aware, or should be aware, that is very separate from the things that I do. The things that occur on our page, the opinion page, really should have to do with opinion, and they involve our opinions and the opinions of many others. The issues that Lisa deals with in developing news stories, and whether they be political or otherwise, they are intended to be reported on objectively and thoroughly, and with as little of our influence, our opinion, or our writers' opinions as possible. Neil Holdway is deputy managing editor for Late News. He is in charge of really putting together the paper every night, and in charge of the staff that does that. Kelly Vold is senior digital editor for Engagement. She manages conversations that we have on our Facebook and Instagram pages and Twitter and that sort of thing. Michelle Holdway is news editor. She works closely with Neil, who, yes, is her husband, and they work together. And I assure you that if you have any fear that we won't have diversity of opinions on our board, have no fear. Michelle and Neil have no problems in disagreeing with each other or disagreeing with any of us when it comes time to make a point or discuss details of what our editorial should be. Robert Sanchez is city editor. He's in charge of reporters and overseas reporters and daily news reporting, government, crime, schools, and all other manner of reporting. And John Lampinen is our former editor. He's retired. He just retired at the end of 2021, actually. He retired at the end of 2021, but he has remained on the board and still participates very heavily in some company events, but especially writes editorials occasionally for us and is a really valuable voice on our editorial board. And how we work, how we come up with topics. Editors are assigned dates when they're responsible for an editorial. These things can be loose, and if something comes up that we think is important, needs to be changed, it is and will be changed around. But in general, we create a foundation that we work from, and an editorial will be expected to come up with something that they think is important for us to talk about and to discuss with the public. And they'll make a pitch on that topic to the board. They'll suggest an approach, or maybe even just ask for what they think or thinks we should say. Members will respond and give some ideas, and then that person is expected to write the editorial himself or herself and share a draft of that editorial with the board. He or she will get revisions that the board suggests and say, yeah, you said that right, but I think maybe you should have said this. Maybe you shouldn't include that, or maybe you should phrase that a little bit differently. And then the final draft will be produced, and that's the editorial that gets published in the paper. So we use that process generally in creating this series. It was a series that it really started from my thinking. As we get close to the end of the year, we start thinking about holidays and trying to come up with something that's going to be engaging for people during a time when a lot of news is focused elsewhere. And I've been thinking a lot about election issues the last couple of years, really, as many people have, and many conscientious people who care about the democracy have been. But I also have been realizing that there are many things that we aren't talking about that we should be, that also have to do with integrity and the strength of our election, faith that we have in our election process, things about how we elect judges, how we determine who's going to be the winner of a race. A lot of these issues are things that just aren't being discussed so much as campaign financing and voter access and some of these other issues that are right at the top of the list, as well they should be. So I made a proposal to the board in November and said, hey, let's, at the end of the year, let's look at a series of things that people aren't talking as much about and see if we can't come up with ideas and some suggestions that will get people talking about them and maybe move towards some action that can improve things in the long run. The board agreed. We settled on a 6-day series. We brainstormed a bunch of ideas for topics that we could come up with. And I assigned the writers for them, and the writers researched those topics and then wrote the specific editorials really according to the process that we just saw. We started with what I think is really, for me, the most important element of the series, and an issue that really would like the state to look into. I don't know if politically we're in a place where there's motivation for lawmakers to do it, but I really hope that people start talking about it and start motivating lawmakers to think about ranked choice voting. One of the best examples for me of that keeps coming back to my personal thinking, and if you're familiar with the Daily Herald Editorial Page and you're familiar with our opinions about Donald Trump and whether he was ever fit to be president, and my belief is that he would never have been president if we had had a ranked choice voting. The Republican primary began with 17 candidates, and Donald Trump kept getting the same 40% election after election. And while some candidates would drop off, one who was probably the least favored among all 17, or one among the least favored among the 17, kept being winner, kept doing very well. And if there had been an opportunity for candidates who, among those other 16, if all the voters, there were way more voters who wanted somebody other than Donald Trump than who wanted Donald Trump, but they had only one choice. And so of those 16, they tended to ferret out all of those votes, and we ended up with what we got. And that happens over and over. It happens in school boards. It happens in local municipalities. It happened in, you could argue that it happened in the Democratic primary in the same way that Hillary Clinton was able to overcome the voices of many people who wanted a Bernie Sanders, because other people were able to be spoilers and take votes away and limit the ability of a secondary candidate to get some attention. So ranked choice voting is a system that has only one flaw. It's a reasonable flaw, but it's not overcomable. It is complicated. It can be complicated, but it also can assure that whoever becomes elected wins with over 50% of the support, and that should, in my view, always be the case. It shouldn't be the case that a candidate with 30% or 35% support of the public becomes the person who wins the race and takes the position, whether it's a school board position, a legislative position, president of the United States, whatever it is. It ought to be someone who has broad support from the public, and ranked choice voting is a system that allows that. To get into maybe some of the more specific details about that, if you're interested later on, but in general, our faith in it had to do with more this ability to broaden the opportunities of other candidates to become elected and to become front runners to make sure that main candidate that people support, the candidate with the most general support, is the one who ends up winning. And also, I think a big factor for this is that very often a secondary candidate like a Bernie Sanders or even a Donald Trump can't get attention from voters because voters will see somebody else as the one who really ought to win, or that if the main candidate doesn't win, their candidate doesn't have as good a chance of winning, and so they won't vote for someone who they'd really like to be their preferred candidate, and because they know that he or she's not going to win. Ranked choice voting allows them to at least provide some support for that person, at least to show that there is support. And if that person doesn't eventually win, at least the person's candidate, the person really cares about will still win, or that secondarily cares about can still win. But they've also had a chance to make a statement about a candidate that they care about. And that seems to me an important part of what it should be in our elections. The second day, we looked at a subject that really had also many technicals. It's also very difficult to keep specific because it can be so broad. But there were really three pieces and statements that we wanted to make. One was that electing judges, even at the local level, is fraught with all kinds of problems. We see it, and it touches us in the newspaper every time there's an election, because conscientious voters want to do the right thing. They want to select judges who are reasonable, who are good, who have a good sense of what the law is, who will operate with integrity and objectivity. But how can they know that? In some races, there are literally 100 judges on a ballot for retention, or new judges to be elected. How can an individual voter be expected to follow things well enough to know and make a reasonable judgment? So they often turn to us, and we do our best to provide some reporting on who judicial candidates are, or at least what some of the bar associations believe are qualified and what their relative qualifications may be. But it just proves to be a very challenging way to make sure we get the right types of judges on the bench, even on the local bench. On a second issue, it had to do with our state Supreme Court, where it really emphasized this challenge. If you followed the state Supreme Court race, even of last November, it had almost nothing to do with the various candidates' relative temperaments, their knowledge of the law, their qualifications, their experience, their previous judgments. What it had to do with was whether they were likely to support abortion or oppose abortion, whether they were likely to support gun control or anti-gun control, whether they were likely to support more voter access or less voter access. All of those important things, of course, but they were political issues, not judicial issues. And so the race for Supreme Court, the highest court in the state, became a political race, not a race to determine who might be the best person to interpret the laws of Illinois. So I really feel that an election in a race like that is not the best way to go. However, in our third issue, simply appointing judges also is not the best way. As we've seen in our own U.S. Supreme Court, it has become more partisan than most of us have seen in our lifetimes. And issues related to selecting Supreme Court justices often focus and really come down to partisan lines, Democrat, Republican, and not would be the best judge. One of the great difficulties we had with this editorial was that we all wanted to suggest some ways to do it better. And there are ways to do it better, and there are some things that we can suggest. They all need to be part of the discussion. But really felt that we were getting bogged down and getting away from the real issue, which was we have to start talking about doing it differently. It's not just a matter of, okay, let's add a bunch of other judges so that we end up with more voices and maybe we can drown out the voices that we don't like. got to find a way to get between appointing and electing judges, so that we have judges at the really foundational point of our society, who are making rulings about our laws and behaviors, the things that guide our everyday life, that are based not on politically partisan thinking, but on objective legal thinking. And of course, that can never be done. We're all human beings. It's never going to be possible that a person can divorce themselves entirely from their personal and points of view, but there are certainly ways to do it better. Hope we'll start talking about that. From that, we moved into some things that were really more close to home, and but also important, and it also had to do with election integrity to some extent. Also, to some extent, this is an issue that affects us in the newspaper particularly strongly, because we have such a hard time communicating with candidates at every level when it comes time to start reporting on them, and this is difficult in congressional races where you have candidates who are very sophisticated and have staffs who reach out and may be willing to talk to the newspapers. It's difficult in legislative candidates, legislative races, and state positions where, again, you have a little bit more sophistication in the candidates, and they are more likely to work with the newspaper and make sure that we know who they are, and that they can get questionnaires from us and get things from us so that we can report about them to the public. And then it becomes really difficult in elections like we're having right now for municipal and school boards, where these are just everyday citizens who shouldn't be expected to know how to get in touch with the newspaper, or how to get in touch with a radio station, or how to make themselves known, or even be contacted by us to provide us information that we can share with others. So we just felt and believed that fundamental change could be made to how petitions are offered, to require that a campaign email be part of that petition, so that we can contact the candidates, let them know what kinds of information and questions we need to get out there. We have a lot of questionnaires that we're going to publish online. We can be sure that we get to everyone and that no one gets forgotten, that everybody gets an equal chance of getting heard. That's all very difficult to do. And it is also true just from a voter standpoint. It's hard for me to understand why candidates wouldn't want to be able to interact with regular voters, and at least hear some of the things directly that people want to say to them, whether it's pro or con, and having to do with their campaigns. Providing an email address would be an excellent way to do that. We also believe that elections have to do with things and actions, and not just people. Referendums come up almost every spring, and they often can get bogged down in partisanship and emotionalism, and it's very difficult for conscientious voters sometimes to get honest, forthright information on both sides about a referendum issue. Of course, we try to report on it as best we can, but we believe that an even better way would be to require anybody who's promoting a referendum to present mailings, at least one mailing before an election, that says, here's the pro of the issue that we're trying to advance, and here's the con. Here's why it would be good for you. Here's why it would be bad. Objectively, you as a voter can see these things. It doesn't have to be great detail, but it can be in enough detail and enough of a description that at least someone who votes can know that they're voting with confidence in understanding the basics of what it is that they're going after. Finally, we took some, or not quite finally, but as one of the later elements of the series, we did look at an election integrity, and we did look at things that bother us about the debate over our elections today. One of the key things that concerns us, and it underlies the entire series, has to do with the lack of faith that the public has in our elections today, or that is appearing in our elections. And it's coming from many, many different directions, and it has a lot of different tentacles and elements. And we know that no one thing is going to change it. But one of the things that disturbs us is that a lot of the foundation of this distrust is based on suspicion and conspiracy theories and things that people believe but have no evidence to support. And as a result, that's leading to a lot of efforts for voter to make it harder to vote. And we think the opposite should be true. It should be as easy as possible for people to vote. And so we really wanted to say, hey, if you want to improve our elections, then let's look at campaign finance. Let's improve the way that our campaigns are financed and gets big money out of the campaigns. Let's look at redistricting and the way that different parties can organize the system so that they maintain control and can influence us improperly or overly. And let's look at how advertising occurs and what candidates can say about themselves and can say about their opponents, and what is true and how they have to be monitored to say things that are actually true and be more forthright and transparent in the way they campaign. So tried to make that point with this editorial. And then finally, we looked at a couple of reforms that actually we believe have caused harm. For me, the one that is most worth reviewing and I would dearly love, in my heart of hearts, I suspect is probably the least likely of all the things that we're talking about today to actually get attention. But if you really stop and think about what happened in the late 70s, or it might have been 1980, when the cutback amendment was put on the ballot and Illinois' system was changed so that previously we had 3 representatives in each Senate district, and no more than 2 of them could be from the same party. So that guaranteed that one minority party person would be representing that area in that Senate district. And when we cut back to only 2 representatives in every district, it created the system we have now, where it's so easy it has become so easy for a single party. Right now, it happens to be Democrats. In some portion of the 1990s, it was Republicans. In 10 years, who knows, it may be Republicans again. It can be too easy for one party to get firm, complete control of the legislature, of the mechanisms for creating laws, and not just create that control, but not have it even modified by some other voices. Where the system previously at least allowed enough of the minority party, and if you look over the history, there were times when the minority party was Democrats and times when it was Republican, but it ensured that that minority party had a voice, and it ensured that because there were enough of them to make a difference, the majority party had to take them into account, had to at least consider what they had to say. We don't see that today. That I think that's a severe problem, and it has done a lot to divide our state and divide us partisan camps. Less problematic, but also an issue, is combined elections. We combined a few years ago, the elections for school board, which had been held in fall every other year, with the elections for municipalities, which are now held in the spring. So whereas previously voters had 2 opportunities to look at what's happening to them locally, and they now have just 1, and they have so many more candidates and so many more issues to deal with. It has really made it much more difficult for voters, I think, to understand the issues facing either their schools or their municipalities. They can't concentrate on one or the other, and as a result, both get short shrift. So I've spoken for a long time, and this is really what our series tried to do, where we were trying to go, and what our thinking was. Now I'm looking forward to hearing what your questions are and seeing if I can answer some of them.
Thank you very much. So you mentioned the need to overhaul redistricting. Philip Pogue asked, will ranked choice work in Illinois with the gerrymandering that has meant in recent elections no contest or non-competitive races?
I think ranked choice voting is the answer for those things. Personally, I think we get no competitive races because someone feels like, well, what's the point? The other party's going to win. And I also think that so much of our elections have swung to what happens in the primary, so that so really the primary is where a lot happens, and that has, because many candidates are not willing to go up against somebody who may have good name recognition, or it's harder for multiple candidates. It's so easy for a fringe candidate to come out ahead in a primary that that it damages what happens in our general election a few months later. And ranked choice voting, I think, would give a greater opportunity for secondary candidates to win, and that would encourage more candidates and less opportunity for these races that are so common. And if you look at our last legislative races throughout the state, there were a large number of races that were not races. They were just one candidate because people had lost faith in the elections. I think ranked choice would give them more faith.
Thank you. Picking up on your theme of our problems with partisan primaries, Ed Spire is asking, I'm interested in how the final 5 voting system that replaces partisan primaries has been shown in Alaska to enable the election of more moderate legislators. Should this approach be more widely adopted in our state?
I'm sorry, can you repeat it? Did you say the Alaska election were you talking about?
Is it the final 5 voting system replaces partisan primaries? So it's one
Yes.
approach to a nonpartisan primary.
I think that's another issue that is well worth talking about. That's kind of what happened in Alaska, and my personal view, regardless of who had won, I think the victor in the race in Alaska was more representative of Alaska voters than would have happened under Illinois' system today, because as a result of that, you had 2 Republicans and a Democrat running for a seat, and interestingly, Democrat was not the favored person in the beginning, but ended up being the winner because she had a broader base of support than Sarah Palin, who was better known and had a strong support from a certain number of people, but not as strong throughout the rest of the population. So I think the Alaska system is well worth looking at.
Another question about ranked choice and primaries. Assuming it would take a while to adopt, this is from Rosemary Heilman, assuming it would take a while to adopt ranked choice voting, what do you think of having presidential primary elections on one single day and providing for runoff until ranked choice voting can be adopted?
Having the primary on a single day and for runoffs. I think that essentially sounds like the same thing. It just takes more time. And my personal belief is that as we open up our elections, there used to be, we wanted the results, and we got to a point where we could get results within 2 hours after the polls closed. Wasn't that a wonderful thing? Yeah, for us, it was great in the newspaper because we could turn that around the next day, and we made our deadlines and get a newspaper that had all the results, and that was fantastic. But now with mail-in votes and other votes that have to be tabulated afterwards, the results of the election aren't necessarily so sure that quickly. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I personally think it's, we ought to be trying to get the candidates who the people support the most, not just trying to be efficient in our elections. It takes a little bit more time, then I'm all for that.
I understand that a number of our voting authorities do not have the equipment that permits ranked choice voting. So would you begin the discussion at the local level, or should we be taking it up at the state level?
I think it's been done across the country in various ways. I think it is true that many of our locales don't have the equipment. Part of the challenge in starting that discussion from, let's say, a state level would be, well, those local governments still don't have it. And so how are they going to get it? Somebody's going to have to give them money to get it. And so why not if, say, Cook County wants to start it, or Lake County, or McHenry, or DuPage says, hey, let's start ranked choice voting, and we have the equipment that can handle it. Why not let them handle it for their local elections for certain things? I think obviously there would be complications that wouldn't make sense, that if you had ranked choice voting for a state representative in DuPage, but you didn't have it for a state representative in Cook County, that obviously wouldn't make sense. But there could be ways that you could do it for at least local elections that could be valuable and might be a good start for people to get people accustomed to it.
I don't seem to have access to the chat right now. Does anyone else seeing questions about on the chat? Are they coming through there?
Yeah, there's still a bunch of questions here in the Q&A box, Jean.
Right. I just wanted to make sure we weren't missing some in the chat.
No, there shouldn't be any in the chat.
Okay. Then Joan Brody is wondering, is there a flaw in ranked choice voting, and what's the downside of it?
The biggest downside, I think, is that it is somewhat complicated to understand, especially as it involves multiple candidates, which to me is its greatest advantage too, but its greatest disadvantage is when you look at trying to discern, okay, we have 5 candidates for 3 seats, and we want to guarantee that the ones with the broadest support are the ones who get elected. There are some fairly complicated mathematical formulas that are required to work that out. The system generally says, let's say, I think if you have 4 candidates, 25% is the element. If you have 25% of the votes, you're guaranteed victory. So the way they look at it is, okay, so that person wins, and then you look at the person who's at the bottom and the others, and you sort of give a percentage of the remaining vote of whatever votes over 25% that person got. You spread that percentage out among the other candidates. And as you can tell from me talking about it already, it starts getting and sounding somewhat complicated, and is, but it's not too complicated to understand. And it's certainly not too complicated to work into formulas and the things that can be worked out. But I do think that one of the great challenges for folks like me and anyone else who really supports ranked choice voting would be to help people understand that it's actually better for the system to have these computations, and it's actually better for the system for us to go into this complicated math. Or it's not that horribly complicated. Any high school student could do it, but it does require a little bit more thinking and a little bit more time. And I think that is the one factor, the most difficult factor that we have to overcome. I think it's also been shown that most of the people who make this argument right now are those who support sort of fringe candidates and who want to say, hey, ranked choice voting makes it harder for someone like a fringe candidate to get their voice heard and to get out there and to get attention. And I suppose that's an argument to me. It's an argument for ranked choice voting, not against it. So
this one, it sounds like a simple question, but I know that there's a relatively complex answer. But the question is, why would ranked choice voting give people more hope?
Well, I think because you would find fewer cases in which someone who has really strong support from a less, or less sizable portion of the population winning. Someone, our current system makes it much more easy for someone to get out of a primary who is not necessarily the candidate that the majority of that party prefers. And so if you take someone who was able to get out of a field of 5, but wouldn't have won face to face against any one of those other 5, but then you put them up head to head against just one other person in a general election, suddenly the influence and the power of that one person has grown exponentially and way beyond what I think is good for the party and good for the public.
A question about, I guess this, as much as anything, is would you consider in a future series of these articles addressing the importance of eliminating the Electoral College, that saying all other elected officers are decided by direct popular vote?
Oh, I'm very glad somebody raised that. We have in the past expressed concerns and doubts about the Electoral College. And so we're kind of on record already as being not totally in favor of it. So yes, I expect that we will over time as that, and I think that falls under the umbrella of one of those things that people are talking a lot about these days. And so we didn't get into it as much, but it is certainly something that I think we need to keep our eye on, and likely we'll speak out about it at various times.
Mm-hmm. Switching gears, Erica Nelson is asking regarding faith in election process and results. As you mentioned, we've seen a number of apparently baseless claims of election fraud. How do news reporters and local media reinforce facts to get the truth in front of the public consistently? What is your process or editorial decision making about publishing information that's known to be lies?
That is an interesting question, and it's an issue that we deal with very consciously, and we try to be conscientious about it. On one hand, we believe that that our reporting should not reflect our reporters' biases or our newspapers' biases or our editors' biases. That our reporting should tell all the sides of an issue. But when one of those sides is openly lying and openly distorting or misstating facts, we have become a lot more consistent nowadays about at least pointing that out. It may still be important as part of a campaign, and people might accuse us of refusing to of lying in a fashion ourselves by not letting a candidate make his or her points of view known, or her belief in the facts known. But at the same time, if they are, and if that is an important part of a story, we at least try to say what the true facts are, and especially as it relates to voter irregularities. Almost all of our stories point out that there's no evidence yet to support the notion that there were voter irregularities of any kind, or at least not substantially, in the 2020 election, or in our most recent ones, or any other elections that we know
of. How do you intend to keep this conversation going? As I mentioned that people would like to see even more editorials like this. For instance, one was mentioned about a problem of or need for a signature requirement challenges that keep independent candidates or others off the ballot. So addressing those nomination processes. I kind of murdered that question. Let me try it again.
Mhm.
It was, how can we address nomination processes such as the signature requirement challenges that keep independent candidates or others off the ballot? You may or may not have an answer to that right now, but I guess the follow-up question is, do you intend to have some more of these types of editorials addressing issues like that?
Yeah, let me first state that the quick answer is yes on both of those points. I also want to make a point related to your previous question that I don't want to lose. One of the dangers, one of the challenges that we face for people who make misstatements about fact and issues in campaigns is that they don't trust us either. And the public doesn't trust us. So it makes our ability to truly influence them much harder. And we have to think about who we're speaking to, and hopefully we're speaking to folks like the League of Women Voters, or people who are really conscientious about voting. And if we can reach them, and we try to focus our conversation there rather than on those folks who, no matter what we say and no matter how many times we say that there's no evidence to support voter fraud, we're wrong or we're lying, whatever. So I'm sorry, I wanted to make that point of how difficult that is. But then as far as keeping conversations going on both of these things, yes, we haven't talked a lot about nomination processes, although I think we may have had an editorial last fall when certain races ended up candidates getting kicked out, or we had some cases where really frivolous challenges of campaign petitions came about. And in fact, I'm sure we did. And we talked about the fact that there are these technicalities that, he didn't staple it on the right-hand side in the upper left-hand corner, 2 inches from the first word on the page, or whatever the rule might be. That there are all these little technicalities that get things thrown out. And yes, I'm sure that we'll be watching for those, and that is campaigns come about, and trying to lend our voice to making that system more accurate. Petitions obviously need to be truthful, they need to be accurate. We need to fight fraud in them and keep them from being fraudulent. But we also shouldn't turn them into like weapons to just get candidates out so that voters don't even have a chance to vote on someone. So yes, that's something that we'll care about and continue to. In the conversation on these editorials, I hope we'll find other opportunities. We found one just this week. We noticed that in Wisconsin, there's an election for Supreme Court, and it was a chance for us to say, you know what, look what's happening in Wisconsin. If you read the story about what's going on there, it's exactly what was happening in Illinois. No one is talking about which candidate is the better judge. There are 4 candidates, 2 conservative, 2 liberal, and that's how they're being viewed, not as legal minds, as people who know the law, who have good respect among other attorneys and judges, who have a strong history of making judgments. They're being viewed as liberal or conservative. And in my view, and I think in our editorial board's view, if that's what's making you choose a judge, it's the exact wrong reason to choose that person. And so we had an editorial this week sort of restating that.
I hear you, but I think it's a very complex situation. We've seen how partisan the Supreme Court is. You wrote that party affiliation should not have any relevance to the selection of judges, and yet in this political climate, clearly it does, no matter how the judges are selected. If we continue to have to vote them in, don't the voters need to be aware of their party affiliation?
Oh yeah, well, yeah, I don't have any problem with that necessarily, and I think it makes sense for people to know what their party might be. My goal would be not to elect them at all, to find some other system so that whatever their party affiliation is, that it's less relevant. But yes, voters need to know what their party affiliation is, but we also got to find better ways to report about who they are as as judges and attorneys than who they are as political figures.
Following up on that, you mentioned the concerns about campaign finance, and certainly there's a part of the problem, I think, with the court is that we need stronger ethics provisions for members, particularly of the Supreme Court, but of others as well. And perhaps how could we get stronger I don't know, requirements for the jurists to reveal where their campaign finance is coming from?
I'm not sure what the specific laws are related to judicial candidates. I assume that they're pretty similar to other candidates. There are almost no limits on campaigns, and there's all these possibilities for PACs to hide behind names that a PAC is supporting somebody, but you don't know who the PAC actually is or what they are. And we've got to find ways for, that's part of what we said in our voter integrity element of this series. We've got to find ways to be more transparent so that people actually know who's supporting a judge, who's supporting a state legislator or would-be state legislator, and not letting their name suggest that they might be somebody that almost anybody would want to support. And we've got to find better ways. I think that is going to require some action at Congress and maybe at the state level too, to impose specific requirements on these organizations so that the voters at least have a chance to know who they are. And then, of course, for newspapers and other agencies need to be reporting on them, which I think none of us do quite to the degree that we should.
So I think we know how you'll answer this, but the follow-up is, what do you think about national PACs financially supporting local candidates, which I think we're seeing in some school board elections?
Yeah, at the minimum, people need to know about it. I think it's a practice that ought to frighten people at the local level. Regardless of what Jim Slusher's points of view are, he shouldn't be telling somebody in Georgia what should be running for their school board or who should be winning their school board race. That should be up to the people of that school district. And if I happen to have enough money to support somebody who I think is going to promote my political perspective and help diminish some other perspective, I think that's a horrible thing. And I think we've got to find ways. I don't think they're easy. All of these conversations are very complex. How do you keep someone if you have free speech in a society, how do you keep someone from offering their speech to support a candidate? At the same time, if there is an agency that is not local, that's going to end up influencing who runs on the school board or the library board or the park board in my local town, democracy is in real trouble. If it can't be I live in Mount Prospect, and if it's suddenly the people who are deciding whether I get to have a community center are from somewhere in Chicago or somewhere in Lyle or somewhere in California, what kind of democracy do I have? I don't have any. Got to find some way to address that.
So apparently ranked choice voting is the most popular topic of the evening.
Good.
So I'll go back to a couple more questions about that. One was, would ranked choice not work in school board races, having congressional restrictions on the number of members who could serve from that area?
I'm not sure that I'm not sure I understand the question completely. I don't think there would be any congressional restrictions on the number of candidates who could serve. No, I would say that in fact, ranked choice voting would be better in school board races in general, because it gives you a better chance to create, because the school board races and municipal races, you're almost always selecting multiple candidates. You're filling 2, 3, or 4 seats. And if you have 7 or 8 candidates for those seats, under our current system, well, it's pretty easy for, maybe the most popular person wins, but maybe the second most popular doesn't get on because somebody else is able to get more votes than one of the other 7. Ranked choice voting allows for the management of those other votes, so that you don't find as much of a chance for someone who has a very narrow but strong level of support getting on a school board, say, or on a village board. It's much more possible with ranked choice voting to see that, well, that person will get their votes, but maybe 1 or 2 others who are more inclined to be aligned with the thinking of the general population will have a better chance of getting on the board. I think that's better in the long run.
Right. And I think you've made your position pretty clear on this, but one question is, would you say that ranked choice voting is more democratic?
Much more, yes. Yes, I would say it is much more democratic than what we have right now. Its whole purpose is to be more democratic. It provides more opportunity for more voices to be heard, and a much better chance for people who have broader support, and not just people who have a small, really strong level of support, not majority.
So coming back to the role of newspapers, how have cuts in staff and professional journalists impacted maintaining the integrity of the Fourth Estate?
I think they've hurt a number of ways, and particularly some of them relate to what we're talking about now with just elections. When I first joined the editorial board almost 30 years ago, we interviewed the candidates for judges, and we endorsed in the races for judges. We had enough staff that we were able to involve editors in that process, and we were able to be much more robust in the way we covered local elections. Our staffing now is considerably less than it was in 2008, and because of that, we have to make more considered judgments about the races that we cover to report, and certainly about the races that we endorse in, and we just don't have the staffing to really go into them. Sometimes people have different feelings about whether we should endorse or shouldn't, and some people think, hey, just keep yourself out of it and let me make my own decisions, and who cares what the newspaper thinks, and I understand that point of view. But there are many other people who like to at least see what we think, and who recognize that we do a great deal of work to get to know the candidates and their positions, so that they have that balance against their own thinking otherwise. But to do that requires a level of work and responsibility that we are having less and less of nowadays, because we just don't have the staff who can put that amount of we want our endorsements to have value. We want them to be respectable and respected. And in order for that to happen, we have to give them a certain level of work that we can't give to as much as we used to. So we do much less endorsing now than we used to. And the same goes for coverage.
I really appreciate all of your thoughtful writing and responses this evening. And I'm going to turn it back over to Chris Corrigan.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jean, and thank you so much, Jim, and of course our at-home audience. You guys were amazingly engaged, and Jim, you were an amazing speaker. But I have to pass this over one more time. Cantigny Park is so grateful for you all, so I have to say, Judy Beaver, can you please take us home this evening?
I certainly can, Chris. So thank you again to Jim Slusher for speaking tonight about these important topics. And by the way, I really love the editorials. We want people talking about these issues too, and yes to campaign addresses on petitions. We're grateful that you spent the evening with us. And thanks to our audience, as Chris said, for joining us tonight. And a big thank you to our partners at Cantigny and our sister league, Central Kane County, Glen Ellen, Naperville, and Roselle Bloomingdale. Please remember the local elections are April 4th. Our leagues are having candidate meet and greets and forums to educate voters, so please vote. And we hope you'll join us Thursday, March 9th at Cantigny or online for our civic awareness program, Banned Books, Intellectual Freedom, Libraries, and You. Joyce McIntosh, who is the Assistant Program Director for the Freedom to Read Foundation, will be presenting. So please join us then. We look forward to seeing you in person next month. So good night and thank you again.
Thank you all.
Thanks.